The cartel thought they were untouchable, burning farms, killing innocents, and seizing land without consequence. But when they set their sights on an aging Montana rancher, they made a fatal mistake. Wade Thorne isn't just a farmer. He's a former Delta Force commander, a ghost from the battlefield, and a man with nothing left to lose. They came to take his land. Now he's coming to bury them in it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Montana morning was crisp and still, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones. Wade Thorne stepped out onto his porch, coffee steaming in his hand, eyes sweeping across the land he had spent decades tending. The golden fields stretched far and wide, bordered by the rugged tree line of the distant hills. The mountains stood tall beyond them, ancient and unmoving, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. Atlas, his German shepherd, sat at his side, ears twitching at every rustle of the wind through the tall grass. The dog was always alert, always watching, just like Wade. He reached down and scratched behind Atlas's ears, feeling the tension in the animal's frame. That was the thing about old soldiers, whether man or beast. The instincts never faded. Wade's had been sharpened over 3 decades of war zones and covert operations, and even though he had walked away from that life, it had never truly let him go. He set his coffee down on the porch railing and adjusted his worn leather gloves before stepping down into the dirt. Morning chores were second nature to him, checking the fence lines, making sure the cattle were grazing where they should be, keeping an eye out for predators. Routine kept a man grounded, kept the ghosts of the past at bay. He'd built a life here, a quiet one, far from the chaos of the world he used to inhabit. But something felt different today. He walked the perimeter of his property, Atlas trotting beside him. As they reached the eastern side of the ranch, near the old oak tree that had stood longer than he had been alive, Wade noticed something off. He crouched down, running a calloused hand over the damp earth. Fresh tire tracks, deep grooves, the kind made by heavy vehicles, not the usual pickup trucks or ATVs used by the local ranchers. They weren't from any delivery he was expecting, and he sure as hell hadn't driven out this way recently. Atlas let out a low growl, nose sniffing along the tracks. Wade followed the marks with his eyes, tracing their path as they veered off toward the tree line. Someone had been watching. Someone had been here when they shouldn't have been. He straightened slowly, dusting the dirt off his jeans. His mind was already running scenarios, analyzing threats, calculating responses, old habits he thought he'd buried along with his past. This wasn't random. It wasn't lost hikers or local kids joyriding. This was reconnaissance. The distant hum of an approaching truck pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a familiar old pickup rolling down the dirt road toward him, kicking up dust in its wake. The truck came to a stop a few feet away, and Sarah Bennett climbed out, her face lined with concern. "Wade," she called, shutting the door behind her. "I was hoping I'd find you out here." He wiped his hands on his jeans and met her at the gate. "Something on your mind?" She nodded, glancing over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "It's the Hendersons. They're gone." "Gone?" Wade frowned. "What do you mean gone?" "I mean they packed up in the middle of the night and left town." "No warning, no explanation," she said, crossing her arms. "This morning a group of men in black SUVs showed up at their place, looking real comfortable. Strangers, not local." Wade's eyes darkened. "Cartel." Sarah nodded grimly. "That's what folks in town are saying. They've been moving in slow, buying up land, forcing people out. If they can't buy you, they scare you. And if that doesn't work—" She trailed off, her meaning clear. Wade glanced back at the tire tracks. "You think they came sniffing around here?" "Wouldn't be surprised," she said. "You sit on some of the best land in this valley, Wade. High ground, good access to the main roads. If I were them, I'd want it." Wade let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. He had seen this play out before, in places far more dangerous than Montana. It always started small, quiet offers, whispers of deals too good to refuse. Then came the threats, the accidents, the disappearances, a systematic takeover. Sarah's voice softened. Wade, this isn't just some local gang. These people are different. They're organized, well-funded. The sheriff's got no power here and people are scared, no one's standing up to them. Wade looked out over his land, his grip tightening around the wooden fence post. He had left the battlefield years ago, had sworn he was done fighting. But some fights found you whether you wanted them or not. They don't know what they're walking into, he muttered under his breath. Sarah gave him a wary look. What do you mean? He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Nothing, he said simply. You should head home, Sarah. Watch yourself. If they haven't come knocking yet, they will soon. She hesitated, searching his face, but Wade's expression was as unshakable as the mountains behind him. Finally, she gave a small nod and climbed back into her truck. You be careful too, Wade. As she drove off, Wade stood in the middle of his land, watching the horizon. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the mist that had settled in the fields. But a different kind of storm was coming, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Atlas let out a soft whine, sensing the shift in his master's demeanor. Wade reached down and scratched the dog's head absently. Come on, boy, he said, turning back toward the barn. There was something he needed to check. Beneath that old barn floor, buried under years of dust and secrecy, was a past he had hoped to leave behind. But some things don't stay buried forever. The afternoon sun hung low over the Montana Valley, casting long shadows across the dry earth. Wade stood by his porch, arms crossed, watching as 3 sleek black SUVs rolled up his long dirt driveway. Dust plumed behind them, the engines humming low and steady, like a pack of wolves sniffing out their next kill. Atlas stood tense beside him, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Wade gave the dog a slow, calming stroke behind the ears, but his own instincts were flaring just as sharply. This was no social visit. The SUVs came to a stop just past the main gate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the idle rumble of expensive engines and the distant call of crows overhead. Then the driver's side door of the lead vehicle swung open and a man stepped out. Felix Spectro Reyes. Wade recognized him instantly. Not from personal history, but because men like him always carried the same air, an unnatural blend of wealth and violence, of polished shoes and blood-stained hands. Felix was lean, sharp-featured, dressed in an immaculately tailored suit that felt out of place against the rugged Montana backdrop. His black hair was slicked back, and a thin scar traced the side of his jaw. He was the kind of man who smiled without warmth, who shook hands while calculating the best way to bury a knife in your back. Felix adjusted his cufflinks and strolled forward, hands in his pockets, surveying the land like he already owned it. Behind him, 5 men exited the SUVs, dressed in casual business attire, but Wade could tell from their stances, from the bulges under their jackets, that they weren't here to negotiate contracts. These were enforcers. Wade stepped off the porch slowly, posture relaxed, playing the part he wanted them to see. An old rancher, tired but stubborn, set in his ways. He let the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. Let them feel like they had to work to get his attention. Finally, he exhaled. Something I can help you with? Felix smiled, all charm, but Wade saw the calculation behind it. Senor Thorne, he said, his voice smooth, polished, the kind of voice that had coaxed hundreds of men into signing their own death warrants. What a beautiful property you have here. Wade didn't answer. He just looked at Felix, waiting. Felix gestured toward the valley. My employers and I have taken a great interest in this region. The land here is valuable. We're looking to invest, expand our operations. And your ranch, it sits on a particularly important location. Wade scratched his chin, feigning ignorance. That so? Felix nodded. We'd like to make you an offer, a generous one. He motioned, and one of his men stepped forward, producing a sleek black folder. The man opened it, revealing a contract on crisp white paper and a number scrawled at the bottom. $3 million. A ridiculous sum. More than twice what the land was worth. Wade let out a low whistle. That's quite an offer. Felix spread his hands. We believe in rewarding those who see opportunity. Take the money, Senor Thorne. Enjoy a well-earned retirement. You won't get a better deal. Wade reached out as if to take the contract, but instead he closed the folder and handed it right back. Not interested. Felix's smile thinned. His men shifted slightly, sensing the shift in the air. Perhaps I wasn't clear, Felix said, his voice losing a degree of warmth. This isn't just about money, it's about opportunity. The valley is changing. You can be part of that change or, well, sometimes people find that change is difficult to resist. Wade tilted his head, letting the words settle. He noticed one of Felix's men edging closer to the barn, pretending to examine the landscape, but really scanning the area, checking defenses. Another man lingered near the porch, his hand resting casually near his belt. Sloppy. Trying too hard to seem casual. Felix took a step closer, lowering his voice. We both know how these things go, Wade. Ranching is a hard life. Accidents happen. Cattle go missing. Buildings catch fire. And the law, well, the law has a way of looking the other way when it's convenient. Wade let the moment stretch, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and took a slow step back, adjusting his old baseball cap. You boys sure do talk a lot. Felix blinked, momentarily thrown off. Excuse me? Wade motioned toward the SUVs. Big suits, fancy cars, waving around a pile of cash like it's gonna impress me. And now, you're standing on my land, telling me how things are gonna go. He exhaled, shaking his head. I've seen this movie before. Felix's jaw tightened, but Wade wasn't done. Let me tell you something, son. His voice was even now calm, steady. This land's been in my family a long time. I've put blood, sweat, and years into it, and I don't scare easy. He locked eyes with Felix. So if you and your boys are done admiring the scenery, I suggest you get back in those fancy cars and drive on out of here. For the first time, Felix's mask cracked. Just a flicker of irritation, of something darker beneath the charm. One of his men tensed as if waiting for an order. Felix exhaled through his nose, then forced a smile. I see. You're a man of principle. He retrieved a sleek business card from his pocket and held it out. Think it over, Senor Thorne. You have 24 hours. Wade took the card, but only to flick it onto the dirt at Felix's feet. Felix's smile dropped completely now. The moment stretched, tense and unspoken. A challenge. Finally, Felix turned on his heel, signaling to his men. They filed back into their SUVs, engines rumbling to life. As Felix opened the driver's side door, he paused, glancing back. Beautiful dog, he said, nodding toward Atlas. Would be a shame if something happened to him. Atlas let out a low, rumbling growl. Wade's hand twitched toward his belt, but he controlled it. Instead, he spoke, voice calm, but carrying an edge that could cut steel. That, he said, would be a very serious mistake. For the first time, Felix hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. He had expected a stubborn old man, a rancher too proud to see the inevitable. Instead, he had seen something else. Something cold, something calculating. Without another word, Felix got into the SUV and pulled away, his convoy following. Wade watched them go, his expression unreadable. He let out a slow breath and turned toward Atlas, running a hand over the dog's head. They don't know who they're dealing with, he murmured. Atlas let out a soft huff in agreement. Wade turned back toward the barn. There were preparations to be made. Because the next time they came back, they wouldn't be talking. The Montana night stretched vast and silent over Wade Thorne's farm, the distant howls of coyotes the only sound disrupting the otherwise still landscape. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of damp soil and pine, but Wade barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, already shifting gears from that of a simple rancher to the battle-hardened soldier he had once been. His boots pressed firmly into the earth as he strode toward the barn, Atlas pacing beside him, the dog's ears twitching at the faintest disturbance in the air. Wade's hand absently brushed against the German shepherd's thick fur, a grounding motion, a habit formed through years of trust between man and beast. But even Atlas could sense it. Something was coming. As he reached the barn doors, Wade scanned the property one last time, taking in every detail with the same precision he'd used in war zones around the world. The land was quiet, too quiet. The distant tree line, the long dirt road leading up to the ranch, every possible approach was burned into his memory. He wasn't just looking at his farm. He was analyzing a battlefield. He pushed open the barn doors and stepped inside. The scent of hay and old wood greeted him, masking the secret that lay hidden beneath the planks. Wade knelt by a rusted tool bench, his calloused hands moving with practiced ease as he pulled up a concealed floorboard. Beneath it, a steel hatch gleamed under the dim light. Atlas sat beside him, tail still, eyes locked on the entrance. He could feel his master's shift in demeanor, the return of the phantom that had once stalked the world's deadliest battlegrounds. Wade exhaled slowly and turned the lock, spinning it to a sequence known only to him. The hatch released with a quiet click. He pulled it open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, closing the hatch behind him. The underground bunker was more than just a weapons cache. It was a war room, a relic from a past Wade had sworn to leave behind. But old habits, especially the ones that kept you alive, never truly faded. The walls were lined with firearms, explosives, and tactical gear, each piece carefully maintained, ready for a moment like this. The glow from an overhead lamp cast shadows over crates labeled with government insignias, reminders of operations long buried. Wade's fingers traced over the cold steel of an HK-416 rifle, its weight familiar, its purpose undeniable. Beside it, a Glock 19, reliable and deadly, sat holstered in its case. Kevlar vests, night vision goggles, suppressed submachine guns, every item told a story, every piece of gear had a history soaked in conflict. He moved efficiently, methodically checking each weapon, loading magazines with the precision of a man who had done this more times than he could count. Muscle memory took over as he slung the rifle over his shoulder and secured the Glock at his hip. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. Wade reached for a secure satellite phone, an old but powerful device that had been silent for years. He held it in his hand for a moment before pressing a single button. The call rang twice before a familiar voice answered, gruff and alert. Knox. Wade let a small smirk cross his lips. It's Phantom. A pause, then a low chuckle. Well, I'll be damned. Didn't think I'd ever hear that name again. Neither did I, Wade admitted. But we've got a problem. Tell me. Cartel. Expanding into Montana. They've already taken 7 properties in the valley. They came to my door today. That a fact? Knox's tone darkened. What did they offer? $3 million. Cash Knox let out a whistle. That's not an offer, Wade. That's a warning. I know. Wade ran a hand over his jaw. They'll be back. I need the team. There was no hesitation. Cyrus, Zane, and Nash? Yeah. They're scattered, but I'll get them. We'll be there by morning. Bring everything. Knox's voice turned serious. How bad is it? They don't know yet, Wade murmured. But they will soon. After ending the call, Wade turned to the bunker's workbench, where detailed maps of the valley lay spread out. He examined the terrain with a practiced eye, marking potential attack routes, flanking positions, and fallback zones. The cartel had chosen this valley for a reason. It was remote, well connected to key trafficking routes and sparsely populated, ideal for smuggling drugs, weapons, and people without drawing too much attention. The fact that they were offering $3 million up front meant they were desperate. Desperate men made sloppy decisions. Wade's gaze moved to satellite imagery pinned to the wall. He marked off 7 properties, farms that had already fallen under cartel control. If they secured his land, they'd control the main road in and out of the valley. Strategic territory. He knew how they operated. First, they made an offer. Then came intimidation. If that didn't work, they made an example of you. Not this time. He grabbed a pen and began circling key locations on the map, calculating the best places to lay traps, position snipers, and establish strongholds. This wouldn't just be about defense, this was about control. His phone buzzed. A text, James Mercer, FBI. Confirmed cartel activity in your area. 7 properties taken. Heavy weapons suspected. Be careful. Wade replied with a simple message. Wade, handling it. A few seconds later, another response. Mercer. Figured you'd say that. Just don't make me clean up too much of a mess. Wade smirked. No promises. As Wade secured the bunker and climbed back into the barn, Atlas suddenly went rigid. His ears perked, his muscles tensed, and a deep, rumbling growl built in his throat. Wade didn't even have to look. He knew what it meant. Someone was coming. He moved silently toward the barn door, pressing his back against the wooden frame, peering through a small gap in the planks. The night was dark, but the headlights cutting through the trees told him everything he needed to know. The SUVs were back. Too soon. Felix Reyes wasn't supposed to return for another 24 hours, which meant one of 2 things. Either they had changed their minds about playing nice, or they had already decided he was a problem that needed to be removed. Wade felt it then, that familiar calm before the fight, the stillness that had carried him through countless battles. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and reached down to scratch Atlas behind the ears. Stay close, boy. The German shepherd didn't make a sound, but his stance remained tight, his breathing steady. The first SUV rolled past the gate, moving slow. Too slow. Wade exhaled, disappearing into the shadows. They were about to learn exactly what kind of mistake they'd made. The moon hung high over the Montana Valley, casting a pale glow over Wade Thorne's farm. The crisp night air carried the scent of damp earth, pine, and distant cattle. The only sound was the whispering wind threading through the fields, rustling the tall grass in soft, rhythmic waves. But Wade knew better. Something unnatural had disturbed the night. Atlas had sensed it first, his ears twitching, his stance shifting from relaxed to alert. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the barn's shadows, his nose pointed toward the tree line beyond the pasture. Wade followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the scope of his PVS-31 night vision goggles. Then he saw them. 3 figures moved through the darkness with trained efficiency, using the natural cover of the landscape. Their movements were slow, methodical, military-trained but not disciplined enough. They were cartel enforcers, sent for reconnaissance, not a direct attack. But Wade knew how this worked. Scouts paved the way for the executioners. He crouched low, remaining perfectly still. His rifle rested weightlessly in his hands, finger poised just outside the trigger guard. He had spent years in the shadows, tracking threats like these through hostile environments, striking without warning. Tonight, the hunter had become the hunted. Wade moved like a shadow, his boots silent against the damp soil. He knew every inch of this land, every natural blind spot, every noise-dampening patch of grass. The cartel soldiers, for all their training, were stepping into a domain where they had no control. The first man came within striking distance, his suppressed rifle scanning the barn. He never heard Wade move. A precise garrote looped around his throat, yanked back with a silent force that cut off both breath and sound. The enforcer struggled, hands clawing at the wire, but Wade's grip was ironclad. Within seconds, the body went limp. Wade lowered the corpse to the ground without a sound, retrieving the man's suppressed pistol. He wouldn't need it anymore. 2 left. The second scout was moving toward the back of the house, his weapon raised cautiously. Wade stalked him through the high grass, his breathing steady, movements perfectly measured. As the enforcer passed by the water trough, Wade struck, one arm wrapping around the man's jaw, the other driving a blade into his ribs. The soldier convulsed, his last breath escaping in a silent wheeze before Wade eased him to the ground. The third man sensed something was wrong. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness, his grip tightening on his weapon. Too late. A thwip cut through the air, a suppressed shot from Wade's pistol striking the man's knee. The enforcer collapsed, gasping in pain as he clutched his shattered leg. Wade emerged from the darkness, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The cartel soldier's breathing was ragged as he looked up, his eyes widening in horror at the figure standing over him. Wade crouched beside him, tilting his head slightly as he studied the man's face. "Tell your boss something for me," Wade murmured, his voice quiet, lethal. The enforcer swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "El Fantasma is hunting you." The man's face drained of color. Wade saw it, the flicker of real fear in his eyes. The cartel ran on power, intimidation, and violence. They had never faced a ghost before. Wade leaned in closer. "You walk out of here tonight. But if you ever step foot on my land again, you won't leave." He stood, tucking his pistol back into its holster, then turned and disappeared into the night. The enforcer sat there, still clutching his leg, heart pounding in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, staggering away into the darkness, back toward the cartel. The message had been sent, and Wade knew it would spread like wildfire. Felix Spectro Reyes slammed his fist onto the hood of his SUV, his face contorted with rage. The survivor from Wade's farm knelt in front of him, his wounded leg wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. His hands trembled as he recounted what had happened. "Silencioso," the enforcer whispered. "We never saw him. He was just there. One moment we were moving in and the next Carlos and Luis were dead." Felix's jaw tightened. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. "Did you see his face?" he demanded. The enforcer shook his head. "No, just his voice. He called himself El Fantasma." Felix's men exchanged uneasy glances. The stories had already begun circulating that something unnatural protected the valley, that men sent to Wade Thorne's land simply disappeared. Felix exhaled sharply, regaining his composure. He crouched, grabbing the enforcer by the collar. "You listen to me, cabron. There's no ghost. That rancher? He's just a man." He forced a smirk, trying to suppress his own unease. "And men bleed." The cartel lieutenants around him nodded, but their faces told another story. They'd heard the whispers in the ranks. No one wanted to be the next one sent onto that land. Felix turned to his second-in-command. "We double our men. Heavy weapons. We go back tomorrow." He glanced down at the injured scout. "And you? You spread the word. Make sure everyone knows. This valley doesn't belong to a ghost. It belongs to us." But even as he said the words, Felix felt something crawl under his skin. A cold, quiet doubt. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if that was true. Back at the farm, Wade stood at the edge of his porch, watching the night settle over his land. He had seen this before. How fear infected soldiers, how doubt fractured even the strongest of armies. He had used it against warlords, terrorists, and militias across the globe. Now he would use it against the cartel. He stepped inside and grabbed his radio. The frequency crackled to life. "Knox, you copy?" "Yeah, Phantom. We're an hour out. Change of plan. Let's make them believe their own stories." Knox chuckled on the other end. "Psychological warfare? I like it. What are we thinking?" Wade exhaled slowly, his mind already formulating the strategy. We let them think they're fighting something they can't understand. We reinforce the myth. Let them see shadows where there are none. Make them hear things in the wind. Let them fear the ghost before they ever see him. Cyrus's voice cut in. We turning this into a haunted house? Not haunted, Wade murmured. Hunted. Atlas let out a quiet growl, his eyes still fixed on the distant tree line. Wade scratched the dog behind the ears, nodding to himself. Tomorrow, the cartel would come back. And tomorrow, they would learn what it truly meant to be afraid. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it something more than just the scent of pine and damp earth. Fear. It clung to the air like mist, seeping into the minds of those who dared to enter. By morning, the surviving cartel scout had done Wade's work for him. His frantic ramblings had spread like wildfire, stories of a phantom who hunted in silence, of men disappearing without a sound, of something watching from the shadows. But Wade wasn't done yet. Fear was a weapon, and he intended to sharpen it. At Bennett's diner, the morning crowd was already buzzing with gossip by the time Wade and Sarah walked in. Conversations overlapped, low murmurs about something moving in the woods, of livestock going missing, of lights flickering on and off in the dead of night. Swear to God something ain't right, Old Man Miller grumbled over his coffee. Last night my security cameras picked up movement out by the barn. Went to check? Nothing. But the fence was open. My cattle don't just open fences themselves. Across the room, a younger rancher, Tommy Thompson, leaned in. Same here. Dog's been barking at nothing. And you know Henderson? Said he saw figures in the fields last night. Tall, thin, moving too fast for a man. Almost like... He hesitated. Like they weren't human. Sarah suppressed a smirk, nudging Wade. They were playing right into his hands. She cleared her throat. You think it's... ghosts? She asked innocently, loud enough for others to hear. Miller huffed. I don't believe in that crap, but something ain't right out there. Tommy exhaled, rubbing his jaw. My grandpa used to talk about this land being cursed. Maybe there's truth to it. Wade sipped his coffee, hiding his amusement. He didn't need to say anything. The fear was building itself. By mid-afternoon, Wade sat on his porch, cleaning his rifle as Sarah pulled up in her truck, dust trailing behind her. She stepped out, tossing him a burner phone. Word's spreading faster than we thought, she said, shaking her head. I just overheard some locals talking to a trucker from out of town. The rumors are hitting the next county over. Wade smirked. Good. What about the cartel? Sarah leaned against the railing, folding her arms. I checked Zane's radio intercepts. Felix and his crew are talking. They're nervous. Some of their men are refusing to return to the valley. She tossed him another phone, one from a cartel frequency. Wade pressed play on a recorded transmission. Telling you, boss, something's out there. We went in quiet, but they were waiting. And we never saw them. Never heard them. Like... The man's voice broke, raw with panic. Like they were ghosts. Felix's voice cut in sharply, though Wade could hear the frustration under his calm exterior. Pull yourself together. There are no ghosts, just men, and men can die. The soldier's breathing was shaky. Then why haven't they? The recording ended in static. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. They're rattled, Wade. Not rattled enough, he replied. That night, Wade and his team moved like specters through the valley. Knox set up false heat signatures along the ridges, fabricated human-like figures that would show up in the cartel's night vision as shadowy, distorted shapes. Cyrus rigged motion-activated sound traps, hidden speakers playing low whispers in Spanish, fragmented words like warnings from the dead. Nash and Zane planted fake graves in the forest, shallow pits with half-buried cartel gear, boots, rifles, shattered radios, suggesting that men had already been buried there. And Wade? He made sure he was seen. From a distance. Never too close. just far enough that when Felix's next scouting party came in, they'd catch glimpses of a figure in the fog, standing still, unmoving, before fading back into the trees, just enough to make them question reality. By the third night, the cartel was unraveling. Felix stood in the center of the cartel's makeshift camp, his patience wearing thin as he listened to yet another panicked report. "We saw them, boss, but they weren't normal." Felix gritted his teeth. "Describe them." The soldier hesitated. "Not human. The way they moved. They weren't running. It was like they were floating." Another enforcer chimed in. "And they're watching us. Every time we get close, they're just there." Felix turned to his second-in-command, a seasoned killer named Mendez. "You believe this?" Mendez didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "We've lost 6 men, Felix. Not a single shot fired. If this isn't ghosts, then it's something worse." Felix scowled. "What's worse than ghosts?" Mendez looked at him, his expression grim. "A hunter who knows exactly how to make us believe in them." Felix didn't respond, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he believed it or not. The next night, Wade took it one step further. He left a single item at the cartel's camp, an old Delta Force challenge coin, placed neatly on a wooden crate, a relic from his past, one the cartel would recognize. When Felix found it, his blood ran cold. He turned it over in his hand, recognizing the insignia, the worn edges from years of use. A message. Not from a ghost, but from someone far worse, someone who knew how to kill men like him before they ever saw him coming. Felix exhaled sharply, his hands tightening around the coin. He'd been in the game long enough to know when he was dealing with something beyond his control, and for the first time he hesitated. By dawn, the story had reached beyond the valley. Local truckers carried it across state lines. Border smugglers whispered it in hushed tones. Within days, rumors of El Fantasma del Valle, the Phantom of the Valley, spread through criminal networks across Mexico and the U.S. The valley was cursed, untouchable, a place where men disappeared, a place where ghosts hunted cartel soldiers. Felix's superiors were listening now, their patience thinning. And Wade? He simply watched from his porch, sipping coffee as the storm built around him. They weren't just afraid anymore. They were starting to believe. The cartel had been pushed too far. Their men were disappearing. Their shipments were failing. Their power was being challenged by something they couldn't see. And men like Felix Reyes? They didn't like feeling powerless. So they retaliated the only way they knew how, with fire and blood. But what they didn't realize was that Wade Thorne had already decided their fate. The first explosion shattered the valley's silence at 1:47 a.m. A towering inferno erupted into the night sky as Miller's barn went up in flames. Inside his farmhouse, Bill Miller jolted awake, heart hammering. He grabbed his shotgun, staggering toward the window, only to see hell itself outside. The barn was fully engulfed. Flames clawed at the night, licking the sky, sending embers drifting across the fields like dying fireflies. And then he saw them. 6 men, dark silhouettes against the blaze. One of them stepped forward, calm, confident, like he owned the land he was standing on. Felix Reyes. His cold eyes gleamed in the firelight, his signature silver pistol hanging loosely from his grip. Bill tightened his hold on his shotgun, blood boiling. Felix smirked. "Put it down, Viejo. You don't want to make this worse." Bill's finger hovered over the trigger. His land, his home. But even he wasn't foolish enough to think he could take on 6 armed cartel enforcers alone. Felix stepped closer, gesturing at the burning barn. This is what happens when you forget your place, when you listen to the wrong people." His meaning was clear. Wade Thorne. "Tell me something, old man," Felix mused, watching the flames reflect in Bill's glassy eyes. "What do you think happens next?" Bill said nothing. Felix's smirk widened. "Smart man. Next time, we won't waste time with the barn." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. His men followed, leaving Bill standing in the orange glow of his burning home. By dawn, the entire valley knew. The cartel had made their move, and Wade Thorne was done waiting. Sarah had lived in the valley her whole life. She'd seen men like Felix before, bullies who thought fear was power. But she had never feared them. Until now. It happened fast. Too fast. One moment she was locking up the diner, the day's cash in her bag. The next, a black SUV screeched around the corner. Doors flew open. Hands grabbed her. She barely had time to gasp before something cold and metallic pressed against her temple. Felix's voice slithered into her ear, his breath reeking of whiskey and arrogance. "Scream, and I start breaking bones." Sarah wasn't stupid. She bit her tongue, swallowing the terror, letting them shove her into the back seat. The SUV roared off into the night, disappearing down the winding dirt roads. When the dust settled, all that remained was her abandoned truck and a blood-stained cartel pendant left on the seat. A message. Not to the valley. To Wade. The second Wade saw the pendant, everything changed. Something dark and ancient stirred inside him. The part of him he'd buried years ago. The soldier, the killer, the phantom. His fingers curled around the pendant, his jaw tightening. Felix had just signed his death warrant. Wade moved fast. No hesitation. Within minutes, his team was gathered in his bunker. Knox, Cyrus, Zane, and Nash, his old brothers in arms. "Sarah's alive," Zane reported, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "They've got her at a hunting cabin 6 miles west. Remote location. 2 escape routes. Guard rotation is loose." "How many?" Wade asked, his voice flat. 10 men minimum," Knox replied, adjusting his sniper scope. "Felix is there too." Wade nodded once. "Good. Game on." The cartel thought they were safe. They had no idea what was coming. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the first shot rang out, a silenced round from Knox's rifle, piercing a guard's skull. Before the body even hit the ground, Wade was already moving, gliding through the shadows like a phantom. Inside the cabin, Felix sat at the table, lazily flipping a knife in his hands, completely unaware. Outside, Wade's team erased his men one by one. A knife to the throat, a bullet to the temple, a silenced scream. Within seconds, the cabin was surrounded. Then, the lights cut out. Felix barely had time to react before the cabin door exploded inward. And Wade Thorne walked in. The cartel reacted too slow. One lunged for his rifle. Wade put a bullet in his skull. Another swung a knife. Wade twisted, snapped his arm, then buried a blade into his gut. Felix grabbed his pistol, but Wade was faster. A boot slammed into Felix's chest, sending him crashing to the floor, gasping for air. Wade loomed over him, his eyes cold, empty. Felix coughed, blood dribbling from his lip. You don't know what you've started." Wade knelt beside him, gripping his knife. "No, Felix." He dragged the blade slowly across Felix's cheek, carving a deep, brutal cut. "You don't know who you pissed off." Felix screamed. Sarah, tied in the corner, gasped as Wade cut her restraints. "It's over," he murmured. She clung to him, shaking. "I knew you'd come." Wade's jaw clenched. "I'll always come." Outside, the last surviving cartel soldier tried to flee. He made it 10 feet before Knox's bullet tore through his kneecap. The screams echoed into the night. Felix lay there, broken, defeated, his own blood soaking into the dirt. "Tell your boss," Wade said, voice deadly calm. "This valley isn't for sale." Then, without another word, he walked away, Sarah safe at his side. Behind him, the hunting cabin erupted in flames, and the valley was silent once more. The aftermath, a new kind of war. By morning, the cartel knew. Felix returned to his boss, disfigured, humiliated, and empty-handed. The valley was no longer just a piece of land. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled, and Wade, he was done waiting. This war had just begun. Wade Thorne wasn't just an old rancher. He was a ghost from a past war, a soldier they couldn't intimidate, outmaneuver, or kill with brute force. And when men like Felix Reyes failed, the cartel called in a professional. The private airstrip outside of Sonora, Mexico, was unusually busy that night. A sleek Gulfstream jet touched down on the runway, its engines humming in the cool desert air. A convoy of blacked-out SUVs waited, headlights slicing through the darkness. The moment the jet's door opened, a man stepped out. El Fantasma. Real name, Colonel Diego Cortez. Former Colombian commando general, ex-cartel enforcer, ruthless, precise, a ghost in human form. His sharp olive-drab combat fatigues and silent calculating stare made him look more like a military leader than a cartel assassin. A man like Felix Reyes? A mere foot soldier. Fantasma? A tactician, a commander, a man who didn't believe in failure. Felix stood stiffly near the SUVs, his scarred cheek still fresh from Wade's knife. The humiliation of his last mission burned inside him. But he remained silent as Fantasma approached. The ex-Colombian soldier barely glanced at Felix before speaking to the cartel's second-in-command. "What happened?" The cartel lieutenant hesitated. "The rancher. He's—" Fantasma's gloved hand shot out like a whip. Felix barely saw the strike coming. A cracking slap echoed in the night as Felix staggered back, blood spraying from his busted lip. Fantasma's voice was ice. "I didn't ask for excuses." Felix gritted his teeth, swallowing the rage. He wasn't stupid enough to fight back. The cartel lieutenant continued. "Thorne is ex-military, special forces, maybe more. He's got a network, but we don't know how many." Fantasma's lips twitched into the smallest smirk. "A single old man has taken out 20 of your men, humiliated you, and you're still not sure who he is?" Silence. Fantasma's boots crunched against the dirt as he walked toward the SUV. "I'll take care of this personally." Felix finally found his voice. "How?" Fantasma glanced back, his dark eyes unreadable. "We stop thinking like criminals. We fight him like a war." By morning, Fantasma had overhauled the entire operation. The sloppy, reckless cartel tactics? Gone. He dismissed Felix's remaining men and replaced them with mercenaries, men who had fought in Afghanistan, Syria, the jungles of South America. Killers. 32 men were flown in, handpicked by Fantasma. Each one trained in urban warfare, counterinsurgency, and night operations. Their weapons? Not street-level cartel guns. They came armed with thermal imaging drones, suppressed MP-7 submachine guns, ballistic armor and reinforced helmets, and jungle warfare-grade ambush tactics. Fantasma watched his men prepare from the balcony of the cartel's mountain villa, sipping black coffee. His second-in-command approached cautiously. "What's the plan, Colonel?" Fantasma set his cup down. "We force him into a kill box." His eyes flickered toward a topographical map of Montana's valley. "He's been controlling the battlefield. That ends now." Fantasma's strategy was simple but devastating. He knew that Wade operated in the shadows, that he thrived on stealth, fear, and unpredictability. So Fantasma would force him into the light. A carefully orchestrated strike would trigger a response, Wade's response. Then, they would be waiting. At his ranch, Wade stood in the darkness, watching. The valley had been quiet for 2 days. Too quiet. The cartel had vanished, and that was the most dangerous sign of all. From the ridge, he scanned the horizon through his spotting scope. Atlas, his German shepherd, lay at his side, ears twitching. Sarah approached quietly, concern etched across her face. "You don't like this?" Wade lowered the scope, exhaling slowly. "Nope. They're planning something." Wade nodded once. His instincts, honed over decades in war zones, screamed that something big was coming. Something smarter. Deadlier. Inside the underground bunker, Zane's fingers flew across his keyboard. He had tapped into encrypted cartel channels, filtering keywords, names, locations. Then, a single name flashed across his screen. His heart stopped. Oh, shit. The others turned. Knox, cleaning his rifle, looked up. Problem? Zane's face was pale. Phantasma. Silence. Then Cyrus let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a name to pop up. Wade's eyes narrowed. Talk, Zane swallowed. Diego Cortez, ex-Colombian commando. Best jungle warfare strategist in South America. He doesn't take jobs. He takes wars. Nash, who had seen some of the worst battlefields on Earth, rubbed his jaw. If he's involved, we're not dealing with a cartel anymore. Knox exhaled through his nose. We're dealing with an army. Wade said nothing, but his grip on the rifle tightened. By sunset, Phantasma's plan was in motion. 3 mercenary teams moved into position around the valley. One team cut off all roads in and out, another set up ambush points in the tree line, and the third? They were preparing a direct assault on Wade's farm. Phantasma himself stood on a hilltop, watching through high-powered binoculars. His men moved like ghosts. No shouting, no reckless gunfire, just discipline and cold precision. Then, his radio crackled. Phase 1 complete, Colonel, moving into position. Phantasma's lips curled into a grin. The hunt was over. Now came the kill. Back at the farm, Wade looked at his team. We've held the shadows long enough. He chambered around into his rifle. Now, we bring hell to them. The cartel had brought an army. Wade Thorne would turn their battlefield into a nightmare. Wade had fought bigger enemies before. He knew that brute force wasn't always the answer. When you were outnumbered, you didn't fight the enemy head-on. You made them fight ghosts. You made them second-guess every step, every movement, every breath. Wade gathered his team in the underground bunker, a detailed valley map spread across the steel table. We won't beat them in a straight fight. His voice was calm, measured. So we make them bleed before the first shot is fired. Knox nodded, already seeing the plan forming. Guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare. Sarah, arms crossed, studied the map. How do we start? Wade tapped the table. We turn this valley into a goddamn haunted house. The first phase of Wade's plan wasn't about killing, it was about control, rigging the land itself to fight for them. By the next morning, Wade and his team were out in the valley, setting their traps. Irrigation explosives. Wade rigged certain underground irrigation pipes with C4. When detonated, it would blast water and debris into the air, creating instant fog to disorient enemy movement. False trails. Cyrus and Sarah rerouted cattle paths and created fake ATV tracks leading into dead zones, trapping enemies into kill zones. Booby-trapped fences. Zane installed pressure-triggered flares near fence posts. Anyone crossing would trigger a burst of white-hot sparks, making them think they were under attack. Mud pits and sinkholes. Farmers used water diversion techniques to turn certain areas of the valley into swamps overnight. Enemy vehicles would become trapped, immobilized, and exposed. By nightfall, the valley looked unchanged. But to anyone stepping in without the right knowledge, it was a death trap waiting to be sprung. The second phase of Wade's plan? Turning every rancher, farmer, and hunter into a tactical observer. No one needed to pick up a rifle. All they had to do was watch and report. Knox trained the local hunters, showing them how to use spotting scopes and trail cams to monitor movement, mimic natural wildlife calls as silent signals, leave false tracks to mislead cartel scouts. Meanwhile, Sarah coordinated with the town's civilians. The mechanics? They accidentally delayed repairs on cartel-rented vehicles. The gas station owners? They mistakenly gave cartel men bad fuel mixtures, ensuring their engines would fail at the worst moments. The town's barbers and bartenders? They fed cartel spies carefully planted misinformation. The cartel thought they were infiltrating the valley. They had no idea the valley was infiltrating them. The third phase of Wade's war? Disinformation, misdirection, pure psychological terror. Zane had been monitoring cartel radio chatter, listening for patterns. Then he began feeding them their own nightmares. Using a voice distorter, he hijacked cartel frequencies at random times in the night, whispering in Spanish, "You are not welcome here. The valley does not belong to you. El Fantasma is watching." It didn't take long before panic set in. Cartel men woke up in the middle of the night, swearing they'd heard voices. One even fired his rifle at an empty barn, convinced something was inside. Then Wade took it further. He and Knox stalked cartel patrols at night, setting off motion-triggered lights and eerie sounds. It wasn't about killing. It was about making them feel hunted. And it worked. Felix Reyes, once arrogant and brutal, now sat in his truck, gripping his gun with shaking hands. He turned to one of the mercenaries. "Did you hear that?" The soldier sneered. "Hear what?" Felix didn't answer, because even he wasn't sure anymore. The final phase of Wade's psychological war wasn't bullets. It was paperwork. Sarah had already started whispering rumors to local journalists. EPA contamination reports. A cursed valley, where men disappear. FBI investigations into cartel activity. By the time the cartel's upper leadership started looking into it, the valley was already poisoned in their minds. They started believing their own lies. Suddenly, the land they wanted wasn't valuable anymore. It was a headache, a money pit. Felix Reyes, still recovering from his wounds, begged Fantasma, "This isn't worth it. Let's move our operations somewhere else." But Fantasma? He was too proud, too arrogant. He had brought professionals for a war, and he was going to have it. At their forward camp, Fantasma stood in silence, staring at a wall of missing men. 15 cartel soldiers had vanished in a week. No bodies, no evidence, just shadows. He turned to his top lieutenant, voice razor-sharp. "Tell me what you know." The man hesitated. "Locals are saying the valley is haunted." Fantasma's eyes flashed with fury. "You're telling me an entire cartel army is afraid of ghosts?" The lieutenant swallowed hard. "Sir, they think El Fantasma is real." Silence. For the first time in years, Fantasma felt something he hadn't felt in war, something that gnawed at the back of his mind. Unease. Back at his ranch, Wade watched through binoculars as cartel trucks started packing up. They were losing their nerve. The valley wasn't just dangerous, it was cursed. Sarah, standing beside him, let out a breath. "It's working." Wade nodded, but his eyes remained on one man, Fantasma. Unlike the others, he wasn't running. He was planning something. Something big. Wade set down the binoculars, cracking his knuckles. "We're not done yet." Because Fantasma was about to make his last, most dangerous move. And Wade would be ready. The cartel thought they were about to win. Instead, they were about to walk into hell. A full moon hung over the valley, casting long shadows over the farmland. The cartel was done playing games. 30 armed men, 3 armored SUVs, 2 drone operators, and at the head of it all, El Fantasma. Dressed in tactical gear, a scarred veteran of countless wars, he stood at the tree line, watching his men spread out. Felix Reyes, his second in command, stood beside him, still recovering from the wounds Wade had given him. No more ghosts. No more tricks. Fantasma's voice was cold, razor-sharp. "Tonight we end this farmer." Felix swallowed. "You sure about that?" Fantasma's glare was enough to shut him up. The command was given. The cartel advanced. The first group moved in silently, spreading through the valley. They expected an easy assault. Instead, they triggered hell. Explosion 1. As one of the SUVs rolled forward, a hidden pressure plate detonated, sending a fireball into the sky. The vehicle flipped onto its roof, its occupants screaming inside. The flood trap. Another team reached a barn thinking they'd found cover, until Wade detonated the irrigation lines. A wall of water and debris smashed into them, sweeping them off their feet, soaking their gear. False cover. 3 cartel enforcers rushed into a small wooden shack, using it as a forward post. A split second later, it exploded into a fireball, taking them with it. In less than 5 minutes, Wade had taken out a third of their force. The cartel tried to regroup. Phantasma barked orders in Spanish, trying to regain control. "Flank the ridge! Find their sniper!" Too late. Knox, from his sniper nest, fired a single round. A cartel soldier dropped before he even heard the shot. Zane jammed their comms, feeding them static. The cartel was now blind and deaf. Sarah triggered the second wave of diversions. A series of motion-triggered lights flickered on randomly, making the cartel believe they were surrounded. Panic started setting in. Wade had been waiting for this moment. As the cartel broke formation, trying to regroup, he moved like a shadow. He emerged from the cornfields, using a silenced pistol to take down 2 men before fading back into the darkness. Atlas, his loyal German shepherd, lunged at an enemy, tearing into his arm, forcing him to fire wildly into the night. Cyrus and Nash opened fire from a ridge, using high-powered rifles to pick off cartel members one by one. The cartel wasn't just losing. They were being hunted. El Fantasma had never seen a battlefield like this. His men were trained for warfare, not nightmares. Half of them were dead or missing. Their vehicles were destroyed. Their comms were jammed. Felix Reyes ran up, panic on his face. "We have to retreat!" Phantasma clenched his jaw. He hated losing. But this wasn't a battle. This was a slaughter. As Phantasma and his remaining men began retreating, they heard a distant voice. Wade, standing on the porch of his farmhouse, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "You should have stayed in Mexico." With that, he pressed a detonator. The last 3 remaining SUVs exploded, sending a shockwave through the valley. The cartel's final escape was gone. Felix fell to his knees, shaking his head in disbelief. "What the hell is this place?" Phantasma's face was stone cold. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to lose a war before it even started. He turned to his men. "Fall back. We'll return." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if they ever would. Wade stood on his porch, watching the burning wreckage in the distance. Sarah exhaled. "They'll be back." Knox nodded, slinging his rifle. "Yeah, but next time they won't come as an army." Wade turned back to his team. Let them try. Because now the cartel didn't just see him as a problem, they saw him as a ghost. And ghosts? They never die. The cartel believed they had seen everything. They thought they had mapped out Wade's defenses, identified his allies, and understood the threat. They were wrong. Because what they had fought so far wasn't the real defense of the valley. It was only the beginning. Wade stood at the edge of his property, surveying the land. The valley looked the same as it always had. Farms stretching to the horizon, cattle grazing, and roads winding lazily between small homesteads. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a peaceful, sleepy town. But Wade's team had spent weeks building something far deadlier beneath the surface. The townspeople had unknowingly become part of a defensive web. Farmers now understood how to delay outsiders, conveniently blocking roads with slow-moving tractors or setting up sudden repair work to reroute traffic. The local hunting club had become spotters, reporting suspicious activity over radio channels disguised as weather updates. Shop owners and gas station clerks memorized faces and vehicles, discreetly updating a shared log of cartel activity. Even the town's teenagers played a role, deliberately spreading disinformation about government land seizures and historical site designations, ensuring no outsider would want to invest here. Without realizing it, the valley had become a living, breathing defense system. Zane sat in the farmhouse, staring at multiple screens. Drones flew high above, undetectable to the naked eye, sending real-time footage of every road, farm, and abandoned shack. Motion-activated cameras dotted the valley, disguised as scarecrows, fence posts, and even birdhouses. Zane smirked as he switched between feeds. They have no idea how blind they are. Every move the cartel made was logged, tracked, and analyzed. They were walking into a trap so large they couldn't even see the edges. While Wade's team controlled the covert defenses, Sarah took charge of something just as important, the town's public resistance. A staged protest was organized outside the local town hall. A dozen ranchers held up signs warning about government land seizures, environmental contamination, and historical site protections. Sarah played her role perfectly, standing in front of a news camera. "They want to destroy our land for corporate greed. We won't let them." The cartel's informants, who had blended into the crowd, were completely fooled. They rushed to report back, telling their bosses that the valley was dealing with bureaucratic nightmares, local government interference, and land disputes. It was all disinformation, and the cartel bought it. Knox sat on the roof of an old barn, cleaning his sniper rifle. Next to him, a younger man, Tommy Thompson, one of the local teenagers Wade had taken under his wing, watched carefully. "So what's the last step of the plan?" Tommy asked. Knox chuckled. "The last step? Make them think we're exactly what they expect." The cartel believed Wade was a military-trained problem that needed a military solution. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Because when they attacked, they wouldn't just be fighting Wade's team. They'd be fighting an entire town. In a dimly lit cartel hideout, El Fantasma reviewed the intelligence reports. Felix Reyes sat beside him, his face still bruised from his last encounter with Wade. "They're cracking," Felix insisted. "Government pressure, land disputes, protests. This valley is tearing itself apart." Fantasma remained silent. He had seen Wade's tactics firsthand. Something didn't sit right. But before he could second-guess it, a new report came in. One of their informants had located Wade's supply depot on the outskirts of town. The cartel had finally found their weak point, or so they thought. Fantasma clenched his jaw and made his decision. "We attack at dawn." He had no idea he was about to walk into the worst mistake of his life. The cartel was done playing games. They had tried everything: bribery, intimidation, assassinations. But Wade Thorne and his valley had held firm, countering every attack with tactics beyond their understanding. Now, El Fantasma was ready to end it, once and for all. In a cartel safe house just across the state border, Fantasma sat in a dark room, watching drone footage of Wade's farm on a laptop screen. He had underestimated Wade before, not this time. Beside him stood Victor Rojas, a former Venezuelan Black Ops commander turned mercenary leader, a man with no allegiance, no conscience, just a price. Fantasma gritted his teeth. Hiring mercenaries was expensive, but Wade's valley had already cost the cartel millions in lost revenue. Felix Reyes, still bruised from Wade's last message, nodded toward the screen. "This time we overwhelm them. Air and ground assault. No more mind games." Fantasma's eyes burned with hate. "No more warnings. No more scouting. No more patience." He turned to Rojas. "How soon can your men be ready?" Rojas smirked. "They're already on the way." By midnight, 24 ex-military contractors had gathered at an abandoned airstrip. These weren't cartel foot soldiers. They had combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and South America. They carried night vision, thermal scopes, encrypted radios. They were disciplined. No useless threats, no wasted bullets. This wasn't going to be a raid. It was an invasion. Back at the farmhouse, Wade, Knox, and Cyrus sat around a dimly lit tactical board, running final simulations. "They're bringing ex-military," Knox said, watching the drone feeds. Wade nodded. "Good. That means they'll expect us to fight like ex-military." Cyrus tapped the map. "They think we're a bunch of aging war dogs. We play into that." A grin spread across Wade's face. "We let them think we're old, slow, predictable." Then he looked at Sarah, Zane, and the network of civilians they had trained. Meanwhile, The real fight won't even be on their radar. The first phase of Wade's deception was simple: appear vulnerable. During the day, Wade and his team moved openly, making sure cartel scouts saw them. Old men stretching, walking with slight limps, adjusting their weapons slowly. Knox acted the part of a retired sniper, shaking his head like he wasn't as sharp as he used to be. Nash set up medical supplies in an exposed barn, making it look like they were preparing for casualties, not a counterstrike. Through intercepted cartel communications, Wade heard exactly what he wanted. They're old, they'll hold their ground, but they'll break under pressure. The trap was set. Just before dawn, the mercenary force moved in. 3 blacked-out armored SUVs led the convoy. Behind them, a military-style Humvee followed, packed with machine guns and RPGs. From the western ridge, a sniper team took position, covering the operation. Phantasma and Rojas watched from a high-tech command vehicle. This wasn't just an attack. This was a war. "Wipe them out," Phantasma ordered coldly. The first explosion hit Wade's barn, sending a fireball into the sky. Immediately, mercenaries moved in, clearing rooms, sweeping the area with thermal optics. Inside the house, Wade and Knox hunkered down, playing the role of old soldiers pinned down. Outside, cartel foot soldiers spread through the valley, searching for Wade's hidden defenses. They didn't realize. The real attack hadn't even started yet. As the mercenaries moved forward, the valley itself turned against them. The abandoned fields erupted with fire. Hidden tripwires detonated fuel traps, sending massive flames into the sky. Gunshots rang out, but not from Wade's house. Snipers hidden in farm silos, water towers, and treetops fired down on the advancing cartel forces. The road behind the convoy collapsed. Cyrus had rigged a controlled explosion under the bridge, trapping their reinforcements on the wrong side. In less than 5 minutes, the cartel's full-scale invasion was cut in half. As confusion spread through the cartel's ranks, the local farmers and hunters made their move. They weren't soldiers, but they didn't have to be. The hunters used bows and silent rifles, picking off mercenaries who strayed too far. The ranchers cut power lines, sending entire sections of the battlefield into darkness. Tommy Thompson and the younger men used dirt bikes, kicking up massive dust clouds to blind enemy snipers. The cartel expected ex-military resistance. Instead, they faced a town fighting like an unseen army. Inside the command vehicle, Phantasma watched the battle crumble. He saw his men retreating from untraceable gunfire. He saw his convoy trapped, burning in the valley. He saw his so-called mercenaries panicking, trained soldiers caught in a war they didn't understand. He clenched his fists. This isn't possible. Then, for the first time, Phantasma realized he had walked into a war zone disguised as a simple valley. Knox had 1 bullet left. Lining up his shot, he exhaled slowly. Bang! The sniper took out the cartel's lead vehicle, causing the last survivors to flee in terror. The valley fell silent. Wade stepped onto his porch, watching the last cartel trucks disappear. Sarah approached, rifle slung over her shoulder. "They're not coming back." Wade nodded, knowing she was right. Phantasma had learned what the others never had. This valley was never for sale. It was a place where ghosts hunted the wicked, and no cartel could ever survive here. El Phantasma had never been outplayed like this. For years he had commanded cartel operations, executed complex military maneuvers, and crushed resistance without breaking a sweat. But now, as he stood inside the wreckage of his command post, listening to the screams of his men retreating into chaos, he realized something terrifying. He had walked into a war he couldn't understand. With the mercenaries falling apart and the ex-cartel foot soldiers fleeing into the valley, Wade knew it was time for the last phase of his plan. "Phase 3, he said into his radio. All at once, the entire town moved as one. Cattle gates swung open, and hundreds of stampeding livestock thundered into the valley, cutting off the mercenaries' escape routes. We know this wasn't just bad luck. Someone planned this. Halverson's voice was firm. So why don't you tell me what really happened? Wade exhaled, glancing toward the wreckage of his barn. His entire body language changed, slumping slightly, adopting the mannerisms of an old man who'd just had enough. Listen, Agent, I don't know much about military tactics or crime syndicates. I know cattle, I know soil, and I know how to fix a fence when it breaks. Last night? I was in my house, heard gunfire, locked my doors, got my shotgun, and waited. Then, next thing I know, the sheriff's rolling in. Halverson studied him, searching for a crack in the facade. But Wade had played this game long before the agent had even joined the bureau. The agent glanced around, noting the lack of casualties among the locals. You mean to tell me a cartel army stormed in here and not a single one of your people got shot? Wade shrugged. Maybe they were too busy shooting at each other. Halverson exchanged a glance with Cooper, who simply smirked and tipped his hat. Sarah Bennett, ever the perfect actress, walked up with a concerned expression, holding a tray of steaming coffee mugs. "Gentlemen," she said sweetly, "y'all must be tired. Long night." One of the deputies, clearly uncomfortable with the sheer number of locals watching their every move, gratefully took a cup. "Miss Bennett," Halverson said, crossing his arms, "you reported cartel activity weeks ago. Surely you have some idea what happened here." Sarah blinked, feigning innocence. "Oh, I did. And I called the sheriff. But you folks never showed up. Guess they just got tired of waiting and turned on each other." Halverson's jaw tightened. He knew he was being stonewalled, but with no hard evidence, all he had were gut feelings. For nearly an hour, agents swarmed the valley, taking statements, trying to piece together a puzzle that made no logical sense. How did a cartel force get completely neutralized without a firefight? Why were these farmers so well prepared? Why did every local story sound just believable enough, but never quite added up? Halverson finally let out a frustrated sigh. "All right," he said, snapping his tablet shut. "For now, we'll classify this as internal cartel violence. But mark my words, this isn't over." He turned to Wade, eyes narrowing. "We'll be watching." Wade just nodded, letting a slow smirk creep onto his face. "You do that." As the feds packed up, Sheriff Cooper lingered, waiting until Halverson was out of earshot. "You're pushing it, Wade." Wade sighed. "I didn't push anything, Coop. They came to my land, tried to take what wasn't theirs. I just helped them leave." The sheriff scratched his chin, watching the last of the cartel members get hauled into federal custody. "There's a difference between self-defense and what you did." Wade met his gaze. "Does it matter?" Cooper studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, shaking his head. "Guess not." He turned, walking toward his truck. Before climbing in, he glanced back. "Just be careful. Shadows don't stay hidden forever." Wade didn't reply. He didn't need to. As the convoy disappeared down the valley roads, Wade finally relaxed. Atlas let out a low growl, as if sensing the tension hadn't fully disappeared. Sarah stepped beside him, folding her arms. "They're not done looking," she muttered. Wade nodded. "No, they're not." But for now the valley was safe. The cartel was broken, and the government had nothing solid to use against them. The battle was over. But the war? It was just beginning. The last of the cartel mercenaries were being loaded into armored transport vehicles, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, their faces bruised and bloodied. The once feared killers who had stormed into the valley with military precision were now nothing more than prisoners, their weapons confiscated, their mission a complete failure. Wade Thorne stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with cold, detached eyes. It was over, at least for now. Sheriff Cooper exchanged a few final words with the FBI agents before stepping back. The cleanup would take weeks. Bullet-ridden trucks, smoldering remains of destroyed cartel strongholds, and bodies that would never be found. But in the official reports, the incident would be classified as internal cartel violence. A turf war gone wrong. Wade had ensured that was the only story they could tell. The last man to be escorted toward the waiting vehicles was El Fantasma. Even in defeat, the ex-Colombian commando carried himself with an air of quiet menace. He wasn't broken, just caged. 2 federal agents flanked him, their grips tight on his arms, but Fantasma didn't resist. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Wade's. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind carried the scent of burning oil and damp earth, the sounds of deputies barking orders, the distant hum of transport helicopters, and the occasional groan of an injured mercenary filled the silence. Then, just as the agents moved to shove him into the vehicle, Fantasma leaned slightly toward Wade. His voice was low, just above a whisper, but the weight of his words carried far beyond the sound. "You think this is over?" Wade didn't react. He simply stared back, unreadable, unmoving. Fantasma smiled, a slow, predatory grin that had sent men to their graves. "We never forget." And then he was gone, pulled into the black SUV, its reinforced doors slamming shut behind him. Wade exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had been in this life long enough to know a warning when he heard one. Sarah approached, arms folded across her chest, watching the convoy of law enforcement and federal vehicles pull away. That didn't sound like an empty threat. Wade glanced at her. Because it wasn't. Knox, standing a few feet away, rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Cartels have long memories, Wade. You humiliated them. Took out their men, dismantled their operation, made them look weak." He paused, his voice turning grim. "They'll come back. Might not be tomorrow, might not be next month. But one day, they will." Cyrus nodded. "And next time, they won't send just one team. They'll come with an army." Wade already knew this. He could see it now. Powerful men in Mexico and Colombia sitting in shadowed rooms, discussing what had happened in this small Montana valley. They wouldn't let it go. Not after the stories that would spread. A cartel force had gone into Montana and disappeared. No one knew how. No one had lived to tell the real story. The underworld would talk. The myths of El Fantasma's Valley would grow, and with every retelling the desire for vengeance would burn hotter. Sheriff Cooper lingered after most of the officials had left, standing near Wade's truck. His face was unreadable, but there was something akin to concern in his eyes. "Tell me, Wade," he said, his voice steady. "Do I need to worry about more bodies showing up in my jurisdiction?" Wade met his gaze. "Not if they stay away." The sheriff studied him, then sighed. "That's what I was afraid of." He adjusted his hat, glancing toward the horizon where the last of the federal SUVs disappeared into the distance. "The feds will be watching," he said. "They don't believe for a second this was just a cartel war." Wade smirked. "Let them watch." Cooper hesitated, then shook his head. "You should leave this life behind, Wade, for good." Wade didn't answer, because they both knew that wasn't an option. As the last of the law enforcement presence faded, the valley slowly returned to its eerie calm. The wind carried the distant sound of cattle lowing, the rhythmic hum of insects, the scent of fresh earth disturbed by battle. Wade turned back to his land. It looked untouched. The damage was hidden beneath the surface. Like him. Sarah exhaled. "So what now?" Wade scanned the horizon, watching as the morning light bathed the valley in gold. "Now," he said, voice low, "we rebuild." Sarah nodded, but she wasn't convinced. "And when they come back?" Wade glanced at her. "They won't find what they're looking for." Knox chuckled darkly. "You planning on making ghosts all over again?" Wade didn't smile, didn't blink. "No," he said simply. "I'm planning on making sure they never come back." And with that, he turned and walked toward his barn, Atlas at his side, his mind already moving to the next battle. Because this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The valley was quiet again. The sun dipped low over the Montana horizon, casting long shadows across Wade's land. The wind carried the scent of fresh soil, mingled with the faint memory of fire and blood. The battle was over, but Wade knew peace was an illusion. Inside his farmhouse, a single burner phone vibrated on the wooden table. Wade stared at it for a moment before picking it up. Only a handful of people had this number. He pressed it to his ear. Yeah. A voice on the other end, calm and measured. CIA. Thorne, you made some enemies. Wade didn't flinch. He'd spent years in the shadows, fought battles that didn't exist on official records. He had been hunted before, but this was different. What do you want? Wade asked, his tone unreadable. The agent on the line exhaled. The cartel isn't taking this loss lightly. They're not just sending more men. A pause. Then, the words that changed everything. They're bringing in outsiders. Wade frowned. Outsiders? The agent's voice was grim. Private military contractors, ex-Russian Spetsnaz, corrupt intelligence operatives. These aren't cartel enforcers, Wade. This is something bigger, more organized. The pieces clicked together in Wade's mind. The failed invasion, El Fantasma's final words, the way the cartel had pulled back instead of retaliating immediately. They weren't regrouping. They were escalating. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him carefully. Knox leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. They could tell something was wrong. Wade gripped the phone tighter. What's the play? The agent hesitated. You know how this works, Thorne. The agency has its hands tied, no official involvement. But off the record, you're in a unique position. You rattled the wrong cages. You can walk away now, or you can end this before it grows. Wade's fingers tapped against the table. The valley was safe, for now. But if the cartel was bringing in a new kind of war, waiting wasn't an option. Sarah took a step forward. Wade? He locked eyes with her. He could stay, defend what they had built. But that meant waiting for a storm that would inevitably come. Or he could take the fight to them. The phone was still against his ear. The agent was waiting. Knox exhaled. I know that look. Cyrus stepped in, shaking his head. If we do this, there's no turning back. Wade's gaze didn't waver. His decision was already made. Where do we start? A pause. Then the agent's voice, firm. Mexico. The line went dead. Wade set the phone down. The war had just begun. The dust settles over the valley, the echoes of battle fading into the stillness of dawn. The cartel came with an army, but they left in body bags, their reputation shattered, their soldiers broken. Wade Thorne, the ghost they never saw coming, had turned their arrogance into their downfall. Sheriff Cooper and the FBI arrive, too late to make a difference. They find Wade, just a weathered old rancher, standing by his barn, tending to his land as if nothing had happened. The official story? A failed cartel incursion met with unexpected local resistance. The truth? A battle fought and won before law enforcement even knew it had begun. But as the surviving cartel leaders are hauled away in handcuffs, El Fantasma smirks, his bloodied lips curling into a warning. You think this is over? We never forget. Wade watches the sun rise over the valley, his home safe for now. But he knows peace is an illusion. The cartel isn't just local, it's international, a hydra with more heads waiting to strike. As the wind carries the distant hum of approaching helicopters, his phone buzzes with a message from an old CIA contact. The question isn't whether the fight will continue. The question is where it will happen next. And this time, Wade isn't waiting for them to come to him. He's taking the war to them. The battle for the valley may be over, but Wade Thorne's war has only just begun. Will he stay and protect his home, or take the fight straight to the heart of the cartel's empire? The real war is coming, and the stakes have never been higher. Want to see what happens next? Don't miss the explosive sequel where Wade goes from defender to hunter. Like, comment, and subscribe for more action-packed stories. Let us know, should Wade strike first or wait for the cartel's next move?